Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Welcome to the Manchester Arena episode of the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Again, for those who are listening to this for the first time, this is a series where there are some podcasts which are entirely run by humans, and then there are some where we use artificial intelligence to analyze documents from major incidents in UK and international history. This episode is about the Manchester Arena, and as ever, we start with a recognition of how the lessons were learnt, and in particular, the lessons for this incident resulted from 22 fatalities and many others who sustained injuries, both physical and psychological, from the effect of the attack. The AI don't go into a huge amount of detail about the actual incident themselves, so I'm going to summarise the incident for you. The Manchester Arena attack occurred on the 22nd of May 2017 when Salman al-Baidi detonated a bomb in the city room of the Manchester Arena, killing himself and 22 others. The city room is an area close to one of the exit doors of the arena. The attack took place at the end of an Ariana Grande concert, and the audience was primarily young people, as you'd imagine. Many people were waiting in the city room to meet and collect concert attendees. The bomb contained nearly 2,000 nuts and bolts and had a devastating impact. Over 100 people were physically injured and many more suffered psychological trauma. The timing was detonated at 22:31, so just past 10:30 in the evening, as the concert was ending, calculated to impact on the most people as they were leaving the venue. I now leave you in the hands of the artificial intelligence podcasters, who will go through some of the findings of the Manchester Arena inquiry and also the Kerslake report that was commissioned by Greater Manchester.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a tough one. The Manchester Arena attack in 2017, if you remember. A suicide bomber detonated right as people were leaving a concert. A lot of young people were caught up in it. Tragic event. We're going through the official inquiry reports. Dense stuff, these are the real deal. Publicly available, but they come from a huge investigation.
It's not about blame, though. It's more about trying to figure out how this happened, what went wrong, really complex event security issues.
Yeah, it's like we have all these pieces. We got to put the puzzle together. What happened? Yeah. Why? What could have been done differently? Like, imagine you're running security for a huge event, a concert like this, thousands of people. Everyone's excited. You're the one who has to keep them safe. And how do you even start figuring out the risks? Who's even in charge? It's a mess.
And that's where we're starting. Yeah, a tangled web, they call it. Right off the bat, the reports show this. You've got SMG, UK. They run the arena. They contract Kerslake for the crowds. Then you've got the British Transport Police. They have to secure the whole Victoria Exchange complex. That's where the arena is. So many groups. Each one has their own way of doing things. And that's where it gets tricky.
Right. So many moving parts.
Yeah.
Like a game of telephone, and the message gets all garbled. The inquiry found that SMG, they relied a lot on conversations with the BTP superintendent, someone with experience there.
But formal chats, right?
Exactly. The inquiry said those chats aren't enough for a real counterterrorism assessment.
They needed more than just casual conversations.
Yeah, they even said SMG should have hired a real security expert long before May 2017.
That's a huge point. It shows a lack of understanding about the threat of terrorism.
Definitely. Okay, so let's talk about risk assessment. This is something that people don't always get, but it can literally be life or death. The inquiry dug into SMG and Kerslake's risk assessments. And they found some things that, well, they're confusing to say the least. SMG's assessment for a potential bomb, they give it the highest severity score. A 5 out of 5. They knew it would be catastrophic.
And this is the crazy part.
Yeah.
They still said the overall risk was low to medium, no matter how big the event was. That's like saying a fire could burn down your house. But you don't think it will, so you don't do anything about it.
It's scary to think about it that way. And this is even worse. When you realize that, counterterrorism police had labeled the arena a Tier 2 site.
Yeah.
Back in 2014.
It was considered a potential target for terrorists.
Right.
That should have been a huge red flag for SMG.
A wake-up call.
They should have been way more serious about security.
Especially since they themselves said a bomb would be devastating. So we're seeing this gap between understanding the severity of an attack and actually taking steps to prevent it. And this brings us to another thing the inquiry found, the training of security staffs.
Yeah.
Think about it. How prepared do you think the average guard is to spot a terrorist threat, let alone react to one?
And the inquiry revealed that Shosek, the company doing crowd management, they focus mainly on crowd control, not counterterrorism.
Really?
Yeah, they weren't trained to recognize the signs, someone planning an attack, or how to respond effectively.
Wow. The inquiry really hammered that point home. They said security needs more than just crowd control. They need to be able to identify suspicious behavior and react quickly and decisively to stop a threat before it even happens.
It makes you think about what security really means. It's not just managing people. It's about anticipating and stopping threats, especially in a world where those threats are always changing, being proactive, not reactive.
Absolutely. And this leads us to something chilling. The inquiry found a blind spot in the arena's CCTV coverage. Right on the mezzanine level. That's where the bomber hid.
Can you believe that?
It's crazy, right?
The report says, even when the camera was pointing at the mezzanine, there were still parts you couldn't see.
A blind spot in a place like that, knowing what happened. If that area had been monitored, maybe they would have seen the bomber, maybe they could stop him. It just shows even a small oversight can have horrible consequences.
Security isn't just about having systems, it's about making sure those systems work and that they cover everything, no gaps.
No room for error. So
Yeah.
we started to see the different groups involved, the problems with risk assessment, the lack of training, and a scary blind spot. And this is just the beginning. We're going to keep digging into this in our next part. All right, so we've been looking at what led up to the attack. Now we're going to the night of May 22nd, 2017, the night of the attack. Volume 2 of the inquiry report. It breaks down the emergency response. And it's tough. It shows some really serious problems with the system.
Yeah, it's hard to read, but it's important. We have to understand what happened in those hours. The report shows all these communication breakdowns, all these challenges that really slowed down the emergency response.
It makes you think. You'd assume at a huge event like this, the communication would be seamless, everyone on the same page. But the inquiry found the opposite, a total breakdown between police, ambulance, and fire services. And this is despite the fact that they're supposed to be working together. It's literally in their guidelines, the National Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, JSIP for short.
And this lack of communication, it had real consequences. The inquiry says it led to delays, getting paramedics into the city room. That's where the bomb went off, where the most seriously injured people were. In those situations, every minute counts. And this lack of coordination, it cost them valuable time.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really hard, the report says. Some of the victims who died might have survived if they'd gotten medical help sooner. It's heavy stuff. It shows the real human cost of these communication failures.
It's heartbreaking. The inquiry also looked at the fire service response, which was really delayed. The fire commander, he couldn't get a hold of the police. They were totally overwhelmed. And they didn't tell him that Operation Plato had been declared.
Operation Plato.
That's the plan for a marauding terrorist attack. Without that information, the fire service was in the dark.
So it's like a chaotic scene, everyone working separately, crucial information not getting shared, leading to a delayed and messy response. But the inquiry doesn't stop there. It goes deeper, looking at what specific people did or didn't do that night.
Like the British transport police officers, who were supposed to be patrolling the city room. They were told to be visible, but the inquiry found they took long breaks, leaving the area unguarded right before the attack.
No way.
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
Especially with all the security concerns. At a big concert, the inquiry was critical of that, saying there was no reason for those officers to leave their post, especially without anyone covering for them. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure to understand how serious the situation was.
And it brings up a bigger question. Was everyone taking the threat of terrorism seriously? Were the procedures there, but people just weren't following them? Did they not understand how bad an attack could be? The report digs into all of this, not just what individuals did, but the attitudes of the organizations. Were they prepared?
It's like peeling back layers. Individual decisions, system failures, blind spots. But the inquiry doesn't just point fingers. It offers solutions. Specific things that could prevent this from happening again.
One that really stood out to me was automatically notifying the fire service about big events like this concert so they can be ready to respond. Imagine if the fire commander had known beforehand about the concert and the potential risks. It could have made a huge difference that night.
Yeah, that makes sense. Proactive communication. working together before something happens, not just reacting after the fact.
Another interesting one, better documentation during a major incident. All emergency commanders should have recording devices to document their decisions in real time, like a black box for emergency response.
That's interesting. So you have a clear record of what happened.
Exactly. So you can analyze it later, learn from it.
Like if those officers in the city room had been wearing body cameras, we'd know why they left their post.
Right. We'd have a better understanding.
And this kind of documentation, it can help us identify problems, gaps in communication, mistakes in judgment. It could even protect first responders from unfair criticism.
Because you have a transparent record of what they did under pressure.
And the inquiry also talked about technology. They recommend licensing for all CCTV operators, even those working at the arena.
So everyone has the same level of training.
Making sure they know what to look for.
So they could spot suspicious activity.
A well-trained operator might have seen the bomber on the mezzanine.
Even with the blind spot.
They could have raised the alarm.
Potentially changing everything.
So we're seeing a pattern here. Better training, clearer communication, planning ahead, and holding people accountable. These are concrete steps to make public spaces safer.
And one of the biggest themes is joint working. The inquiry found that everyone working in their own silo, that was a major problem. They say true preparedness means working together, training together, communicating seamlessly, operating as one unit.
Like those GISA principles we talked about.
Yeah.
The inquiry found that those principles, they weren't being used.
It's like having all the tools, but leaving them in the box when you need them.
It's not enough to just have the guidelines.
They need to be part of everything, the training, the culture, how they work every day.
It's a change in thinking,
In attitude.
in behavior.
This isn't just about looking back, it's about learning and taking action. To prevent this from happening again, security isn't just the job of law enforcement, it's everyone's responsibility.
We all need to be vigilant, work together.
And commit to doing better.
But the inquiry knows this isn't easy. Putting these recommendations into action, it's a huge undertaking. It needs buy-in from all these different agencies. They have to be willing to change how they do things. And of course, it all needs funding. Yeah, it's a big ship to turn around. It takes time and effort. And a lot of people working together. It's not just writing new rules. It's changing how people think. Breaking down those walls between groups. Creating a culture where everyone's prepared.
Exactly. And the inquiry stresses the need for constant training, exercises to keep these lessons fresh. Can't just be a one-time thing. It has to be continuous, always adapting to new threats.
One thing that stood out to me, they recommend a system to track these changes, hold agencies accountable, no more checking boxes. We need proof, evidence that things are actually getting better.
Right, and that's where the government comes in. The inquiry says the Home Office should take charge, monitor how these recommendations are being implemented, and make sure they're actually making a difference.
It's about leadership.
Accountability.
Making public safety the top priority. We've talked a lot about security and the response, but we can't forget the victims and their families. The report doesn't just focus on procedures. It remembers those who died, their stories, the impact their loss had.
Yeah, it's a reminder. These aren't just statistics. These are real people with lives cut short.
And it shows the human cost of these failures.
Yeah.
And how important it is to learn from them. The report also talks about the care gap, that time between someone getting hurt and getting to the hospital, when what first responders do can literally save a life.
And they make an interesting point about firearms officers. Their main job is to stop the threat, but they're also trained in basic life-saving techniques.
Right.
The inquiry says that part of their training needs more attention because they're often the first ones on the scene.
So it's not just about training paramedics. It's about giving all first responders, even police officers, the skills to help right away, before the medical teams arrive.
Exactly. Every second counts. The inquiry also looked at private healthcare providers, the kind that SMG hired for the arena. They need clear standards and oversight.
Because event organizers, they have to make sure the medical care they provide is good enough and that the staff are qualified, ready to handle something like this. The inquiry found that SMG didn't do that. The private provider they hired didn't have the right qualifications or training.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows. Even if you outsource something important, you're still responsible.
It's a lot to think about, but it's important for anyone who cares about safety, about how we respond to emergencies. As we finish this deep dive, the big question is, how do we move forward? How do we take these recommendations and make real change? So this tragedy wasn't for nothing.
And the inquiry asked some tough questions, like how much security do we need? versus how open and accessible do we want public spaces to be? How do we balance safety and freedom? How do we create a world where people can gather without being afraid?
Those are questions we all need to answer.
As a society,
And the inquiry gives us a way to start that conversation, a way to build a safer future.
one thing's for sure.
We can't ignore these lessons.
This deep dive, it's just a glimpse into all the information in these reports. We encourage you to read them yourselves. They give you a real understanding of how complicated security is and how we respond to emergencies in a world that's always changing.
And even though this deep dive is ending, your learning shouldn't stop. These recommendations, they're a call to action for all of us to be more aware, more prepared, more involved in keeping our communities safe.
What will you do with what you've learned today? How will you help create a safer world? Those are the questions we leave you with. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.